1 Marks questions. Chapter 1 The French Revolution. 1 Name the book that has proposed a division of power within the government. Ans. The spirit of the laws. 2 What is livre? Ans. It was a unit of currency in France discontinued in 1794. 3 Define tithe. Ans. A tax levied by the church, comprising 1/10 of the agricultural produce. 4 Who was the King of France at the time of French Revolution? Ans. Louis XVI of the Bourbon family. 5 Who was Olympe de Gouges? Ans. Olympe de Gouges was one of the most important of the politically active women in revolutionary France. 6 In which year the Jacobins planned an insurrection? Ans. In the summer of 1792. 7 Name the newspaper on which the speech of Robespierre was printed. Ans. Le Moniteur Universel. 8 Name the military dictator who established his power over France after the dismissal of Directory. Ans. Napoleon Bonaparte. 9 Who wrote the book, 2 Treaties of the Government? Ans. John Locke. 10 Who wrote the book, The Spirit of Laws? Ans. Montesquieu. 11 Who wrote an influential pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? Ans. Abbe Sieyès. 12 Who wrote the book, The Social Contract? Ans. Rousseau. 13 What was the main objective of National Assembly in France while drafting the Constitution of 1791? Ans. The main objective of National Assembly in France was to limit the powers of monarch. 14 Name the book in which the idea of one person, one vote was mentioned. Ans. The Social Contract. 15 Who composed the patriotic song Marseillaise? Ans. Roget de L'Isle. 16 Who was the head of Jacobin Club? Ans. Maximilien Robespierre. 17 When was slavery finally abolished in French colonies? Ans. 1848. 18 Who was given the status of active citizens? Ans. Only men above 25 years of age who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days of a laborer's wage. 19 Who could qualify as an elector? Ans. To qualify as an elector and as a member of the assembly, a man had to belong to the higher bracket of taxpayer. 20 What was the most important legacy of the French Revolution? Ans. The ideas of liberty, freedom, and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution. 1 The 18th century France witnessed the emergence of the middle class. Who were they and what were their ideas? Ans. The 18th century witnessed the emergence of social groups, termed as the middle class. They earned their wealth through an expanding overseas trade and manufacture of goods such as wool and silk textiles that were exported or bought by the richer members of society. In addition to merchants and manufacturers, the Third Estate included professionals such as lawyers or administrative officials. 2 Describe any 3 causes for the fall of the Jacobin government in France. Ans. The Jacobin government followed the policy of severe control and punishment. All those who were regarded as the enemy of the Republic were arrested and tried by tribunal. If found guilty, they were guillotined. Even Louis XVI was sentenced to death by a court on charge of treason. Finally, opposition to such severe control began to grow and was responsible for the fall of the Jacobin government. 3 What do you understand by the term, Reign of Terror? Ans. The period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as Reign of Terror. Robespierre followed the policy of severe control and punishment. All those who were regarded as the enemy of the Republic were arrested and tried by tribunal. If found guilty, they were guillotined. 4. Highlight the provisions of the Constitution which was introduced after the fall of 3 marks questions. Jacobean Club. Ans. The fall of the Jacobean government allowed the wealthier middle class to seize power. A new constituent was introduced which denied the vote to non-propertied sections of society. It provided for 2 elected legislative councils. These then appointed a directory, an executive made up of 5 members. This was meant as a safeguard against the concentration of power in a one-man executive as under the Jacobins. 5. What role did women play during the revolutionary years? Ans. From the very beginning, women were active participants in the events which brought about so many important changes in French society. In order to discuss and voice their interests, women started their own political clubs and newspapers. About 60 women's clubs came up in different French cities. The Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was the most famous clubs. 6. 3 items A, B, and C are shown in the given outline map of France. Identify these items with the help of following information and write their correct names on the lines marked on the map. I. Port related to slave trade. 2. Region not affected by the Great Fear. 3. Epicenters of main panic movement. Ans. 7. How was the system of estates in French society organized? Ans. First estate and second estate. These estates consisted of the clergy and nobility. About 60% of the land was owned by nobles, the church and other members of the third estate. The members of the first 2 estates, that are the clergy and nobility, enjoyed certain privileges by birth. The nobles further enjoyed feudal privileges. The third estate comprised big businessmen, merchants, court officials, lawyers, peasants and artisans, small peasants, landless laborers and servants, etc. Peasants were 90% population with very low few owners of land. Only the members of third estate paid taxes. 8. What types of taxes were paid by the third estate in France? Ans. Nobles enjoyed feudal privileges. Peasants were obliged to work in their houses and fields, to serve in the army and build roads. Peasants paid a tax called tithes to the church. The third estate paid a direct tax called taille. Indirect tax on salt and tobacco were also levied. 9. How did France saw the subsistence crisis during the old regime? Ans. The rapid increase in population from 23 million in 1715 to 28 million in 1789 led to rapid increase in the demand for food grains. Production of food grains could not keep pace with the demand. Price of bread was increased. Wages also did not keep pace with the rise of prices. So the gap between poor and rich widened. Things became worse whenever drought or hail reduced the harvest. This led to subsistence crisis. 10. What was the significance of the storming of the Bastille? Ans. The first of the French Revolution was fired on 14 July 1789, in the city of Paris. Around 7,000 men and women who formed the People's Militia gathered in front of the town hall and broke into government buildings in search of arms. Finally, they stormed the Bastille, the fortress prison to free political prisoners. The Bastille was hated by all as it stood for the despotic power of King. 11. What laws did the revolutionary government introduce to improve the lives of women? Ans. In the early years, the revolutionary government did introduce laws that helped improve the lives of women. Together with the creation of state schools, schooling was made compulsory for all girls. Their fathers could no longer force them into marriage against their will. Marriage was made into a contract entered into freely and registered under civil law. Divorce was made legal, and could be applied for by both women and men. 12.3 items A, B, and C are shown in the given outline map of France. Identify these items with the help of following information and write their correct names on the lines marked on the map. I. Port related to slave trade. 2. Epicenters of main panic movement. 3. Epicenters of main panic movement. Ans. 13. Why were women disappointed by the Constitution of 1791 in France? Ans. Women were disappointed that the Constitution of 1791 reduced the passive citizens. They don't have the right to vote. They demanded the right to vote, to be elected to the assembly and to hold political office. Only then they felt would their interests be represented in the new government. 14. What do you know about the Estates General? Ans. The Estates General was a political body to which the three estates sent their representatives. In France of the old regime, the monarch did not have the power to impose taxes, rather he had to call a meeting of the Estates General to pass the proposals for new taxes. However, it was the monarch alone who could decide when to call a meeting of this body. 15. Who was Mirabeau? Ans. Mirabeau was born in a noble family but was convinced of the need to do away with feudal privileges. He brought out a journal and delivered powerful speeches to the crowds assembled at Versailles. The representatives of the Third Estate assembled on 20 June in the hall of the indoor tennis court in the ground of Versailles. They declared themselves National Assembly. They were led by Mirabeau and Abbé Sieyès. 16. Who was Abbé Sieyès? Ans. Abbé Sieyès was prominent member of National Assembly. Originally, he was a priest. He wrote an influential pamphlet called, What is Third Estate? The representatives of the Third Estate assembled on 20 June in the hall of the indoor tennis court in the ground of Versailles. They declared themselves National Assembly. They were led by Mirabeau and Abbé Sieyès. 17. Highlight the turmoil of countryside of France, when the National Assembly was busy at Versailles in drafting a new constitution. Ans. In the countryside, rumors spread from village to village that the lords of the manor had hired bands of brigades who were on their way to destroy the ripe crops. Caught in a frenzy of fear, peasants in several districts seized hoes and pitchforks and attacked chateaux. They looted hoarded grains and burned down documents containing records of manorial dues. 18. Locate the following place related to French Revolution on the outline map of France. I. Paris 2. Marseilles 3. Lille. Ans. 19. How was the National Assembly recognized and how did it start exercising its powers? Ans. Faced with the power of his revolting subjects, Louis XVI finally accorded recognition to the National Assembly and accepted the principle that his powers would from now on be checked by constitution. On the night of 4 August 1789, the Assembly passed a decree abolishing the feudal system of obligations and taxes. Members of the clergy too were forced to give up their privileges. Tithes were abolished and lands owned by the church were confiscated. 20. Highlight any three steps taken by Robespierre to establish equality in French society. Ans. Instead of monsieur, sir, and madame, a more equal form of address, citoyen and citoyenne, citizen, was practiced. Churches were shut down and converted into barracks and offices. More expensive bread was forbidden. All citizens required to eat equality bread. 19. What was the position of women in French society? Ans. Most women worked for a living as seamstress, laundresses, selling flour, fruits, etc., or as domestic servants. Only daughters of nobles and wealthier parties studied in convent. Their families arranged marriages for them. Working women also took care of their own families, cooked and washed, cleaned and queued up for bread. 20. Highlight any 3 steps taken by Robespierre to establish equality in French society. Ans. Instead of monsieur, sir, and madame, a more equal form of address, citoyen and citoyenne, citizen, was practiced. Churches were shut down and converted into barracks and offices. More expensive bread was forbidden. All citizens required to eat equality bread. 21. What was the position of women in French society? Ans. Most women worked for a living as seamstress, laundresses, selling flour, fruits, etc., or as domestic servants. Only daughters of nobles and wealthier parties studied in convent. Their families arranged marriages for them. Working women also took care of their own families, cooked and washed, cleaned and queued up for bread. 22. Name some symbols used during French Revolution and what do they stand for? Ans. The broken chain. Chains were used to fetter slaves. A broken chain stands for the act of becoming free. The bundle of rods or faces. One rod can be easily broken, but not an entire bundle. Strength lies in unity. The eye within a triangle radiating light. The all-seeing eye stands for knowledge. The easy of the sun will drive away the clouds of ignorance. 23. What was guillotine? By whom and why was it used? Ans. Guillotine was a device consisting of 2 poles and a blade with which a person is beheaded. 2 was named after Dr. Guillotine, who invented it. It was used by Robespierre. Robespierre followed a policy of reign of terror, of severe control and punishment. Those who followed a policy of reign of terror, of severe control and punishment. Those who did not agree with his methods were arrested, imprisoned and then tried by a revolutionary tribunal. If the court found the guilty, they were guillotined. 24. Locate the following place related to French Revolution on the outline map of France. I. The countries situated on the eastern side of France. 2. Normandy region. 3. Toulouse. Ans. 25. How did France become a constitutional monarchy? Ans. The National Assembly completed the draft of the Constitution in 1791. Its main object was to limit the powers of the monarch. The powers, instead of being concentrated in the hands of one person, were now separated and assigned to different institutions: the legislature, executive, and judiciary. This made France a constitutional monarchy. 26. What was Directory? Why was it removed from France? Ans. The fall of the Jacobins' government allowed the wealthier middle class to seize power. A new constitution was introduced which denied the vote to non-propertied sections of society. It provided for 2 elected legislative councils. These then appointed a directory, an executive made up of 5 members. However, the directors clashed with the legislative councils, who then sought to dismiss them. The political instability of the directory paved the way for the rise of a military dictator, Napoleon Bonaparte. 27. How could abolition of slavery become possible in France? Explain. Ans. Throughout the 18th century there was little criticism of slavery in France. there were long debates in the National Assembly about whether the right of man should be extended to all French subjects, including those in the colonies. But now law was made, fearing opposition from business community. It was finally the conventions which in 1794 legislative to free all slaves in the French overseas possessions. But 10 years later, Napoleon again started slavery. 28 explained three teachings of Rousseau which laid the foundations of democracy. Hans. He upheld the doctrine of popular sovereignty. He believed that government should be based on the consent of the governed. He stated that people are the real sovereigns and kings rule only with their consent. His famous book Social Contract tells us about a contract between the rulers and the ruled, whereby the former would guarantee the freedom and happiness. 29. Draw up a list of any three democratic rights we enjoy today whose origins could be traced back to the French Revolution. Hans. Right to speech and expression, right to equality, equality before law, right to life, right to vote. 30. Locate the following place related to French Revolution on the outline map of France. I. Port Nantes 2, Port Bordeaux 3, Brest. Hans. 1. Describe the main features of the Constitution of 1791. Mention any 5 points. Hans. Constitutional monarchy. The new constitution made France a constitutional monarchy. National Assembly. It had 745 members and was indirectly elected and could legislate. Right to vote. Only men above the age of 25 who paid taxes as equal to 3 days of a laborer's wage were active citizens and can vote. Powers of National Assembly. This body had the organs legislature, executive and judiciary. The Declaration of Rights and Man and Citizens. The Constitution began with this declaration and included rights like rights to life, freedom of speech and freedom of opinion. To write a short note on the reign of terror in France. Describe any 5 steps taken by him to consolidate his power in France. Hans. The period from 1793 to 1794 is known as the Reign of Terror. Robespierre followed a policy of severe control and punishment. Maximum ceiling on wages and prices. Rationing of meat and bread. Peasants were made their grain to the cities and sell it at fixed price. Use of more expensive white flour was forbidden. All were to eat the equality bread, a loaf made of whole wheat. Equality in forms of speech and address. Churches were shut down and their buildings were converted into barracks and offices. 3. What changes people witnessed everyday life after the Revolution of 1789 in France? Hans. After the storming of the Bastille in 1789, a law was passed according to which 5 marks questions. Censorship on press was abolished. The Constitution of 1701 began with a declaration of the rights of man and citizen. It proclaimed that freedom of speech and opinion and equality before law were natural rights of each human being by birth. Newspapers, pamphlets and printed pictures appeared steadily in the towns of France. From France, this printed material traveled into countryside. These publications described and discussed the events and changes taking place in country. The freedom of press allowed expression of the opposing views of events. Each side could now try to convince others of its stand on any event or problem. Much use was made of plays, songs and festive processions which attracted large number of people. 4. Explain the achievements of Napoleon Bonaparte in France. Hans. Napoleon Bonaparte was a military dictator of France. After crowning himself as the Emperor of France in 1804, He saw his role as a modernizer of Europe. He introduced a law for the protection of private property. He introduced a uniform system of weights and measures. Initially, many saw Napoleon as a liberator who would bring freedom for the people. Many of his measures carried the revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern laws to other parts of Europe. They left a long-lasting impact on the lives of people there. 5. Explain triangular slave trade carried on during 18th and 19th century. Ans. There occurred a shortage of labor on the plantations in the Caribbean when Europeans refused to go and work in the distant land. This problem was solved by a triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa and the America. French merchants sailed from the ports of Bordeaux or Nantes to the African coast. There they bought slaves from local chieftains. The slaves were branded and shackled. They were then packed tightly into ships which carried them to the Caribbean. There they were sold to plantation owners. The exploitation of slave labor thus met the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee and indigo. 6. Describe the legacy of the French Revolution for the people of the world. Ans. The 1791 Constitution began with the Declaration of the Rights of Men and Citizen. Rights such as the right to life, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, etc. were considered as basic or natural and inalienable rights which could not be taken. Tipu Sultan and Ram Mohan Roy, Indian individuals, responded to the ideas of liberty and equality coming from revolutionary France. The new revolutionary ideas spread to France-occupied areas in Europe and abroad. People in such areas began dreaming of sovereign nation-states. Colonized people in Africa, Asia and Latin America reworked the idea of freedom from bondage into their movements to create sovereign new states. 7. Which was the important law that came into effect soon after the storming of Bastille in the summer of 1789? How did it change the lives of the common people? Explain. Ans. Abolition of censorship was the important law that came into effect soon after storming of Bastille in July 1789. Newspaper, pamphlets, books and printed pictures flooded the towns of France from where it reached to countryside. They all discussed events and changes taking place in France. Freedom of the press also meant that opposing views of events could be expressed. Plays, songs and festive processions attracted common people through which they could identify with ideas such as liberty or justice. 8. State any 5 causes of the empty treasury of France under Louis XVI. Ans. Long years of war had drained the financial resources of France. Added to this was the cost of maintaining an extravagant court at the immense palace of Versailles. Under Louis XVI, France helped the 13 colonies to gain their independence from the common enemy, Britain. The war added more than 1 billion livres to a debt that had already risen to more than 2 billion livres. Lenders, who gave the state credit, now began to charge 10% interest on loans. To meet its regular expenses, such as the cost of maintaining an army, the court, running government offices or universities. 9. How was church responsible for the French Revolution? Ans. About 60% of the land was owned by nobles, the church and other richer members of the Third Estate. The church enjoyed a certain privilege, that was, they were exempted from paying taxes to the state. The church too extracted its share of taxes called tithes from the peasants, and finally, all members of the Third Estate had to pay taxes to the state. These include a direct tax called taille, and a number of indirect taxes which levied on article of everyday consumption like salt or tobacco. The burden of financing activities of the state through taxes was borne by the Third Estate alone. 10. Explain the role of philosophers in the French Revolution f. 1789. Ans. In two treatises of government, Locke sought to refute the doctrine of the divine and absolute right of the monarch. Rousseau carried the idea forward, proposing a form of government based on a social contract between people and their representatives. In the spirit of the laws, Montesquieu proposed a division of power within the government between the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. The ideas of these philosophers were discussed intensely in salons and coffee houses and spread among people through books and newspaper. Patriotic song Marseillaise composed by poet Roget de L'Isle. It was sung for the first time by volunteers from Marseilles as they marched into Paris and so got its name. The Marseillaise is now the national anthem of France. One described the storming of the prison Bastille in France. Ans. On the morning of 14 July 1789, the city of Paris was in a state of alarm. The king had commanded troops to move into the city. Rumors spread that he would soon order the army to open fire upon the citizens who rose in protest due to shortage of bread. Some 7,000 men and women gathered in front of the town hall and decided to form a people's militia. They broke into a number of government buildings in search of arms. Finally, a group of several hundred people marched towards the eastern part of the city and stormed the fortress prison, the Bastille, where they hoped to find hoarded ammunition. In the armed fight that followed, the commander of the Bastille was killed and the prisoners released. Though there were only 7 of them. Yet the Bastille was hated by all, because it stood for the despotic power of the king. The fortress was demolished and its stone fragments were sold in the markets to all those who wished to keep a souvenir of its destruction. To describe the political and economic condition of France during the 18th century. Ans. In 1774, Louis XVI of the Bourbon family of kings ascended the throne of France. He was 20 years old and married to the Austrian Princess Marie Antoinette. Upon his accession, the new king found an empty treasury. Long years of war had drained the financial resources of France. The cost of maintaining an extravagant court at Versailles was very high. Under Louis XVI, France helped the 13 American colonies to gain their independence from the common enemy, Britain. The war added more than 1 billion livres, currency, to a debt that had already risen to more than 2 billion livres. The lenders who gave the state credit now began to charge 10% interest on loans. So the French government was obliged to spend an increasing percentage of its mixed question budget on interest payments alone to meet its regular expenses, such as the cost of maintaining an army, the court, running government offices or universities. The state was forced to increase taxes. Under what circumstances did the King of France decide to increase the tax? Point 3 and 4 above. 3. Describe the social condition of France during the 18th century. Or how was the French society organized? Ans. A French society in the 18th century was divided into 3 estates, viz. The first estate, second estate and the third estate. The first estate consisted of the clergy and the second estate consisted of nobility. The members of the first 2 estates, that is, the clergy and the nobility, enjoyed certain privileges by birth. The most important of these was exemption from paying taxes to the state. The nobles further enjoyed feudal privileges. These included feudal dues, which they extracted from the peasants. The third estate consisted of 3 categories of people: big businessmen, merchants, court officials, Lawyers etc. come in the top layer. Peasants and artisans come in the middle, and small peasants, landless laborers and servants come under the lowest category of people. The peasants made up of 90% of the population. However, only a small number of them owned the land they cultivated. About 60% of the land was owned by nobles, the church and other richer members of the third estate. Peasants were obliged to render services to the lord, to work in his house and fields, to serve in the army, or to participate in building roads. The burden of financing activities of the state through taxes was borne by the third estate alone. For what was the subsistence crisis in France? How did it arise? The population of France rose from about 23 million in 1715 to 28 million in 1789. This led to a rapid increase in the demand for food grains. Production of grains could not keep pace with the demand. So the price of bread, which was the staple diet of the majority, rose rapidly. Most workers were employed as laborers in workshops whose owner fixed their wages. But wages did not keep pace with the rise in prices. So the gap between the poor and the rich widened. Things became worse whenever drought or hail reduced the harvest. Shortage of food grains led to price rise, riots and death. It is called subsistence crisis, something that occurred frequently in France during the old regime. 5. Who were the groups of people who protested rising taxes and food scarcity in France? What was the result? How did the emergence of the middle class help French society? In the past, peasants and workers had participated in revolts against increasing taxes and food scarcity. But they lacked the means and programs to carry out full-scale measures that would bring about a change in the social and economic order. This was left to the middle class. The middle class became prosperous and had access to education and new ideas. The merchants earned their wealth through an expanding overseas trade and from the manufacture of goods. In addition to merchants and manufacturers, the third estate included professionals, such as lawyers or administrative officials. All of these were educated and believed that no group in society should be privileged by birth. Rather, a person's social position must depend on his merit. These were the groups of people who protested rising taxes and food scarcity in France. These ideas of a society based on freedom and equal laws and opportunities for all were put forward by philosophers too. How did the middle class become important in French society? Points 2, 3 and 4 above 6. What role did philosophers play in bringing about the French Revolution? These ideas of a society based on freedom and equal laws and opportunities for all were put forward by philosophers such as John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his 2 treatises of government, Locke sought to disprove the doctrine of the divine and absolute right of the monarch. Rousseau carried the idea forward, proposing a form of government based on a social contract between people and their representatives. In the spirit of the laws, Montesquieu proposed a division of power within the government between the legislative, the executive and the judiciary. This model of government was put into force in the USA, after the 13 colonies declared their independence from Britain. The American Constitution and its guarantee of individual rights influenced political thinkers in France. The ideas of these philosophers were discussed intensively in salons and coffee houses and spread among people through books and newspapers. These were frequently read aloud in groups for the benefit of those who could not read and write. The news that Louis XVI planned to impose further taxes to be able to meet the expenses of the state generated anger and protest against the system of privileges. 7. Examine the factors that led to the French Revolution. Ans. The war with Britain. France supported American colonies in their war with the Great Britain for their independence. This war led to an increasing debt on the French monarchy. This necessitated imposition of new taxes on the public. B. Privilege based on birth. French society in the 18th century was divided into 3 estates, viz. the first estate, second estate and the third estate. The first estate consisted of the clergy and the second estate consisted of nobility. The members of the first 2 estates, that is, the clergy and the nobility, enjoyed certain privileges by birth. The most important of these was exemption from paying taxes to the state. See subsistence crisis. The high population led to a rapid increase in the demand for food grains. Production of grains could not keep pace with the demand. So the price of bread, which was the staple diet of the majority, rose rapidly. Wages did not keep pace with rising prices. It led to the subsistence crisis. D. Growing middle class. A new class emerged in France because of increased overseas trade. This class was wealthy not because of birth but because of its ability to utilize opportunities. People of the middle class started raising their voice for an end to privileges based on birth. E. Role of philosophers. The ideas of a society based on freedom and equal laws and opportunities for all were put forward by philosophers such as John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They spread awareness through various media. Some from the privileged classes also advocated a switch to democracy. So, finally there was revolution in France. France. 8. Examine the incidents preceding the outbreak of the French Revolution. Ans. Louis XVI, the King of France, had to increase taxes for many reasons. He called a meeting of the Estates General which would pass his proposals for new taxes. B. Voting in the Estates General in the past had been conducted according to the principle that each estate had 1 vote. But members of the third estate demanded that voting now be conducted by the assembly as a whole, where each member would have 1 vote. See, when the king rejected this proposal, members of the third estate walked out of the assembly in protest. On 20 June they assembled in the hall of an indoor tennis court in the grounds of Versailles. They declared themselves a national assembly and swore not to disperse till they had drafted a constitution for France that would limit the powers of the monarch. D. While the National Assembly was busy at Versailles drafting a constitution, riot spread across the country. A severe winter had meant a bad harvest. The price of bread rose. Often bakers exploited the situation and hoarded supplies. After spending hours in long queues at the bakery, crowds of angry women stormed into the shops. At the same time, the king ordered troops to move into Paris. On 14 July, the agitated crowd stormed and destroyed the Bastille. In the countryside, rumors spread from village to village that the lords of the manor had hired bands of brigands who were on their way to destroy the ripe crops. Angry peasants in several districts seized hoes and pitchforks and attacked chateau, residence of lords. They looted hoarded grain and burned down documents containing records of manorial dues. 9. What were the immediate results of the outbreak of the French Revolution? A large number of nobles fled from their homes, many of them migrating to neighboring countries. B. Faced with the power of his revolting subjects, Louis XVI finally accorded recognition to the National Assembly and accepted the principle that his powers would from now on be shaped by a constitution. See, on the night of 4 August 1789, the Assembly passed a decree abolishing the feudal system of obligations and taxes. Members of the clergy too were forced to give up their privileges. Tithes, tax imposed by the church, were abolished and lands owned by the church were confiscated. As a result, the government acquired assets worth at least 2 billion livres. 10. Why did the Third Estate walk out from the Estate General called by the King Louis XVI in France? Ans. A voting in the Estates General in the past had been conducted according to the principle that each estate had one vote. This time too Louis XVI was determined to continue the same practice. But members of the Third Estate demanded that voting now be conducted by the Assembly as a whole, where each member would have one vote. This was one of the democratic principles put forward by philosophers like Rousseau in his book The Social Contract. When the king rejected this proposal, members of the Third Estate walked out of the Assembly in protest. The representatives of the Third Estate viewed themselves as spokesmen for the whole French nation, which demand of the Third Estate was rejected by the king. 11.